There is a kind of story that works best when nothing is trying to win. Tonight, that is the kind we are telling. 6 old signs, 6 quiet places. A gate with 1 careful torch. A garden that keeps its warmth after dark. 2 messengers crossing the same bridge at dusk. A tide house with a lantern in the window. A golden hall after everyone has gone to sleep. And a library where the stars are written small. You do not have to remember them all. If this helps you rest, you can save it for another quiet night. For now, listen to the fire. Let the old book stay open. The first light is already waiting at the edge of the valley. Before the first path opens, let the room settle around you. The chair is close to the hearth. The old book lies on the small table beside it, open to a wheel of signs drawn by hand. The ink is faded in places. The paper has softened at the corners. It does not look like something made to explain a life. It looks like something kept through many winters because people liked returning to it. That is how we will use it tonight. No one is here to tell you what you are. No one is here to rank the signs or turn them into a test or make them sharp. Tonight, the signs are only doors. Aries opens at a valley gate where 1 small flame is enough to begin the road. Taurus waits in a garden where the moon touches wet leaves and old stone. Gemini moves between 2 paths, carrying simple messages through the dusk. Cancer keeps a lantern burning near the tide. Leo rests in a golden hall after the music has ended. Virgo bends over quiet star maps in a library that does not need to be finished tonight. The fire shifts in the hearth. A piece of wood opens with a low crackle. The sound is small, but the room changes around it, more orange along the floorboards, more warmth at the edge of the chair, a little light moving across the page. Outside, the rain touches the window and stops, then touches it again. There is no storm to wait for. There is no secret to solve before sleep. Only the old rhythm of a room at night: fire, rain, paper, breath. If your attention wanders, that is all right. The stories are built to be left and found again. You may hear a gate and miss the garden. You may wake for a lantern and drift before the golden hall. Nothing will punish you for losing the thread. The thread is simple. Someone comes to a quiet place. Something small is cared for. The night becomes easier to cross. So let the book remain open. Let the fire keep its own time. Let the first page turn slowly. And when the valley appears, look only for the torch beside the gate. That is where Aries begins. Old hill country, long before the roads were named, there was a stone gate at the edge of a sleeping valley. The gate had no lock. It had no guard tower. It stood between 2 low walls where moss grew in the cracks and where small white flowers opened in spring. On one side of the gate were the shepherd fields, the low roofs, the goat paths, and the village wells. On the other side were the high paths that climbed toward the stars. Beside the gate, in a niche cut into the stone, there was a torch. It was not a battle torch. It was not carried before kings or armies. It was a quiet torch, used only when someone had to cross the ridge after sunset. Its handle was dark from many hands. Its glass was cloudy at the edges. Its flame, when kept well, was no larger than a closed fist, but it made the first stones of the upper road visible. The people of the valley said it belonged to Aries. They did not mean that Aries came down every night to hold it. They meant that the torch had the same small courage as the first spark in a cold room. It did not ask whether the whole road could be seen. It only lit the next few steps. At dusk, when the sheep bells had faded and the bread ovens were cooling, an old keeper named Elian would walk to the gate and check the flame. He wore a wool cloak patched at the shoulder. His hands were lined from years of carrying water, stacking wood, and lifting the same iron latch through many winters. He knew the names of every family in the valley, and most of the dogs, too. But he spoke very little. The village had learned not to mistake this for unkindness. Elian's care usually arrived as mended hinges, dry kindling, and a path cleared of loose stones before anyone asked. Each evening he trimmed the torch. He cleaned the glass around it. He placed one dry bundle of cedar beside the stone in case the wind came down from the ridge. Then he sat on the low wall and listened. The valley became quiet in layers. First the doors closed, then the carts stopped. Then the last voices moved indoors. Then the river could be heard again, running under the bridge with a steady sound like cloth being folded. Smoke lifted straight from the chimneys when the air was still. If the ridge wind had already woken, the smoke leaned west, and Elian would pull his cloak closer. When the first stars appeared, he would lift his eyes to the ram-shaped cluster above the ridge. Still there, he would say, and the torch would answer in its own way with a soft lift of flame. Many people had used that light. A shepherd coming home late with a lamb under his arm, a midwife crossing to a house beyond the ridge, a girl carrying warm bread to her grandmother after snow, a boy who had lost a goat and found it asleep under a juniper bush not 10 minutes from home. Most returned before midnight. Some did not return until morning. The torch did not ask why they crossed. It simply began the road for them. Elian remembered many of those crossings without keeping count. He remembered the year the spring thaw came late, and the ridge path stayed silver with ice long after the fields below had gone green. He remembered a winter night when 3 neighbors walked together, each holding a lantern lit from the same flame, their lights moving up the first hill like patient fireflies. He remembered children touching the cold stones of the gate in daylight, pretending it was a great border from old stories, then running home when their mothers called them to supper. By night, the gate was smaller and more useful than any story. It was a place to pause, a place to check the strap of a bag, pull a cloak tight, breathe once, and begin. One autumn evening, a traveller came to the gate just as the last light left the hills. She was young, though her cloak was dusty from a long road. She carried no sword, no pack animal, and no map. Only a small copper lantern, unlit, and a folded letter sealed with red wax. The letter had been carried carefully. Its corners were soft from being held, but the seal was unbroken. Elian watched her stop before the gate. She looked up at the ridge path. Then she looked down at the village lights behind her. In the valley, supper lamps had begun to glow. Someone closed a shutter. Somewhere nearby, a kettle lid clicked as steam lifted it once and let it settle. "Is this the road to the upper spring?" she asked. Elian nodded. "It is." "Is it difficult?" "In daylight, no." She looked at the darkening path again. "And tonight?" Elian did not answer at once. He took the torch from its niche and held it low enough that its light touched the stones near her feet. "Tonight," he said, "it is only one step after another." The traveller gave a tired smile. "That may be enough." Elian lit her small copper lantern from the torch. The flame passed from one wick to the other without hurry. For a moment, both lights leaned toward each other in the wind, 2 small answers to the same dark. "Do you want the village in?" he asked. "The road will still be here in the morning." The traveller touched the letter in her hand. "Someone at the spring is waiting for this." Elian did not ask who. He had learned that some messages are heavy even when they are small. He took a second lantern from the niche, lit it, and set the main torch back in place. Then he opened the gate. Its hinges made a low sound, not a groan exactly, more like an old chair accepting weight. "I will walk to the first bend," he said. The traveller looked relieved, but only a little. She was trying to keep her courage neat around the edges. They stepped through the gate together. The path began gently. It passed between 2 banks of grass, then under 3 bent pines, then along a low wall built from stones that had once fallen from the ridge. The last of the village lights stayed behind them, gold and small. Ahead, the road narrowed into grey. Elian held his lantern low. The traveller held hers close to her chest. The air changed as soon as the gate was behind them. The valley had held the day's warmth in its walls and gardens, but the ridge let the cool down freely. It smelled of dry grass, stone dust, and pine bark. Somewhere below, a door closed. Somewhere above, water moved in its hidden channel toward the spring. The traveller heard these things one at a time, then all together, until they became the sound of the path itself. For a while, they walked without speaking. Stone, grass, root, step. Stone, grass, root, step. The rhythm made the road less mysterious. Each time the light reached forward, it found only what a foot could use: a flat stone, a patch of packed dirt, a pine needle shining with old rain. The darkness beyond the lantern did not vanish, but it stopped feeling like a wall. It became only the part of the road not yet needed. At the first bend, Elian paused. From there, they could see the valley below. The village looked very small, as if someone had set a handful of warm beads in a bowl of dark wool. The torch at the gate burned in its niche, steady enough to be seen, but not bright enough to make a show of itself. The traveller looked at it for a long moment. "I thought courage would feel different," she said. Elian rested one hand on the stone wall beside the path. "How?" Louder. The wind moved over the grass. The little flames in their lanterns bent and straightened. "Sometimes it is," Elian said. "Not often." The traveller looked down at the letter again. In the lantern light, the red seal appeared almost black. "What is it, then?" Elian considered the path above them. It climbed between the rocks and disappeared into the first trees. "Most nights," he said, "it is going while your hands are still cold." The traveller breathed out slowly. The answer did not make the road shorter. It did not make the ridge lower. But it seemed to make the next step possible, which was the only kind of help the night required. They went on a little farther than the first bend. Elian did not mention this, and neither did the traveller. The path rose now, and the stones were less even. Once, her boot slipped on gravel, and she caught herself against the wall. Once, a night bird moved in the pines with a soft rush of wings. Nothing followed them. Nothing waited in the dark. The road was only a road, made unfamiliar by hour and shadow. At the old cedar, where the ridge path split toward the upper spring, Elian stopped for the second time. The cedar had grown there longer than anyone remembered. Its lower branches bent toward the road, and its roots held the bank in place where rain would otherwise have carried the soil away. Travellers often touched its trunk as they passed. Not for luck exactly, more because the bark was there, solid and rough under the hand, and because any steady thing becomes a comfort in darkness. "From here," he said, "the water will lead you." The traveller listened. At first there was only wind, pine, and her own breathing. Then she heard it, a faint sound ahead, thin and constant, like a thread being drawn through cloth. "The spring," she said. Elian nodded. "Keep that sound on your left until the path levels." The traveller held the lantern higher. Its copper sides shone softly. The flame inside was still small, but it had steadied since leaving the gate. "Will you wait?" she asked. "At the gate. Can you see this far?" "No." She looked at him then. Ilian's face was calm in the lantern light. "But I can keep the first flame burning," he said. That seemed to be the answer she needed. She thanked him without many words and turned toward the sound of water. Ilian watched only until the lantern passed between the first trees. It moved slowly, then disappeared, then appeared again a little higher, a small copper star among the trunks. After that, it was gone. He did not call after her. A person crossing a dark path does not always need more words behind them. Sometimes words pull the mind backward. The lantern was enough. Ilian turned toward the valley. The walk down was quieter because he knew every stone. He could have done it with no light at all, but he kept his lantern lit for the dignity of the road. The wind had strengthened. It moved through the grass along the wall and carried the smell of cedar smoke from the village. At the first bend, he looked once toward the upper trees. No copper light showed, only darkness, branches, and the faint thread of water. Then, from beyond the trees, very far and very soft, came the sound of a bell. It was the small bell hung beside the upper spring, used not for alarm but to say that someone had arrived. One note, then another, then silence. He did not know what waited for the letter there. A healer, perhaps. A sister. A friend who had asked for word from the valley below. It was not his part to know. The bell had spoken its small message. The traveller had reached the water, and the flame had done what flame could do. Ilian lowered his head for a moment. By the time he reached the gate, the main torch had burned lower. He fed it one cedar stick and adjusted the glass so the wind would pass around it instead of through it. The flame answered by lifting, then settling. The villagers would sleep through most of it. By morning, they would see only that the torch had burned lower, and that a few cedar chips lay near the gate. Perhaps someone would hear that a traveller had crossed in the night. Perhaps no one would. The valley did not need to know every quiet beginning in order to be held by them. Ilian sat again on the low wall. Below him, the village slept. Above him, the ram-shaped stars leaned over the ridge. Between them, in the stone niche, the torch kept its small place against the dark. It did not blaze. It did not chase the night away. It only made the gate visible, and the first stones beyond it, and the bundle of dry cedar waiting for whoever might come next. That was the first movement of Aries in the old valley. Not a charge. Not a victory. Only a little light offered at the edge of the unknown. Beyond the last low hill of the valley, where the road softened into grass and the grass became a path, there was a walled garden that opened only after sunset. It was not locked in the daytime. Anyone could see the old wooden gate between the stones. Anyone could pass it on the way to the upper fields, or stop to read the small carved sign beside it. But in daylight, the garden seemed ordinary. Pear trees, herb beds, a dry fountain, a few stone benches in the shade. At night, when the moon rose over the hill, the garden became itself. The leaves turned silver at their edges. The fountain gathered a little moonlight in its basin. The paths shone faintly where dew had settled into the pale gravel. Lavender leaned over the borders. Time held the warmth of the afternoon close to the soil. Farther in, where the garden widened, an old white bull stood beneath the pear trees, carved from stone and almost hidden by ivy. The villagers said the bull had been there before the walls. They said the first gardener had found it half buried in the hillside, with moss over its back and one horn showing through the grass. No one knew who had made it. No one knew why it faced the moon. But when the garden was planted, the beds were arranged around it, so every slow walk eventually came near the stone bull's quiet place. This was why the garden belonged to Taurus, not because it was stubborn, not because it refused to move, but because it knew how to remain. It knew how to hold a season until the season was finished. It knew how to wait for fruit without pulling at the branch. It knew how to make a home for small roots in dark soil, and how to let each ordinary thing become enough. The keeper of the garden was a woman named Mara. She had worked there for so many years that the pear trees seemed to lean toward her when she passed. Her hair was the color of ash and milk. Her hands were broad, brown, and calm. She wore a linen apron with deep pockets, and in those pockets she carried twine, a small pruning knife, a folded cloth, and sometimes a heel of bread wrapped in paper. Mara preferred to work in the garden at night during the warm months. In the day, there were errands. People came to ask about cuttings, seed packets, bruised apples, and whether the mint had survived the late frost. Someone was always calling from the gate. But at night, the garden could be heard. The soil made a soft sound when it received water. Pear leaves turned in the breeze with a dry whisper. Snails moved under the cabbage leaves. Somewhere along the wall, a night insect sang one note, then paused, then sang again. Mara listened to all of it. She carried a lantern with glass sides, but she kept the flame low. Moonlight was better for some work. It made the weeds easier to see. It showed which leaves had curled in the heat, and which stems had begun to lean too far over the path. It gave every small task a patient edge. On the night this story begins, Mara was kneeling beside the thyme bed. The bed had been replanted that morning. The new thyme was young, with thin stems and grey-green leaves so small they looked like they had been cut from felt. The day had been warm. The roots needed quiet pressing before the soil cooled completely. Mara worked with both hands. She did not hurry. She gathered the loose earth around each plant and pressed gently, just enough to close the air pockets beneath the surface. Then she sprinkled water from a copper can near the roots. The water sank in without a sound. At the gate, someone stopped. Mara did not turn at once. People sometimes paused there in the evening, unsure whether the garden was open or whether they had wandered into a private dream. She pressed soil around one more thyme plant, wiped her fingers on her apron, and looked up. A traveller stood in the gate. They wore a dark coat with road dust along the hem. One hand held a small bag. The other rested on the gate post as if the garden had arrived sooner than expected. Their face was tired, but not frightened. It was the kind of tiredness that comes when the body has stopped walking, but the mind has not. "Good evening," Mara said. The traveller looked embarrassed. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You have not." I saw the lantern. Mara glanced down at the small light beside the thyme bed. Then it did its work. The traveller smiled a little, but their shoulders stayed high, close to the ears. "Is there an inn nearby?" "There is one in the village," Mara said, "across the bridge and down by the mill." The traveller looked back toward the road. The village lights were hidden by the curve of the hill. Only the dark path remained, with the low stone walls on either side and the pale line of the road disappearing into trees. Mara knew that look. "It is not far," she said, "but it can feel far when you have already arrived somewhere." The traveller let out a slow breath. "Yes?" Mara rose carefully. Her knees were old, and she treated them as she treated the garden, with respect for what they had carried. "You may sit on the bench by the fountain for a while." "Are you sure?" "Benches are made for that." The traveller stepped inside. The garden gate gave a small wooden sigh behind them. It did not close all the way. Mara never liked a gate to sound final. They crossed the path together. The gravel moved softly under their shoes. The fountain waited in the centre court, its stone basin silvered by moonlight. A little water had gathered there from the evening mist, just enough to reflect the sky in broken pieces. The traveller sat. For a moment they held their bag in both hands. Mara noticed this and said nothing. She went to a low table near the wall and poured water from a covered jug into a clay cup. Then she cut a small piece of bread, spread it with soft cheese and honey, and set both beside the traveller. "Eat if you want," she said. "Leave it if you do not." "Thank you." Mara returned to the thyme bed. The traveller watched her work for a while. The night deepened by small degrees. The moon lifted higher. The old stone bull emerged slowly from the ivy, first one horn, then the curve of the neck, then the wide, patient back. "What is that?" the traveller asked. Mara looked over her shoulder. "The old bull. Is it part of a temple? Maybe once, or maybe someone only loved bulls." The traveller studied it. "It looks peaceful. It has had time." Mara pressed soil around another thyme plant. After a while, the traveller picked up the bread and ate. They did not seem to notice when their shoulders lowered. Mara noticed. The garden noticed too. A moth crossed the open court. The fountain gave one small drip. The pear leaves moved, then settled. "I have been walking since morning," the traveller said. "That is a long time to ask the feet for answers. I thought reaching the next place would make me feel settled." Mara cupped soil around a plant and pressed it flat with the side of her thumb. Sometimes the body arrives first. The traveller considered this. What arrives after? The rest of you. The traveller laughed softly. It was not a bright laugh. It was tired, but it loosened something in the air. Mara picked up an empty basket and carried it to the bench. "Would you like a task?" The traveller looked uncertain. "A task?" "Only a small one." She handed them the basket and pointed to a clay pot near the path. "Those thyme cuttings need to be tucked into the bed. Press the soil around each one with 2 fingers. Not hard, just enough that the roots know they are not floating." The traveller looked at the basket, then at the bed. "I do not know much about gardens." "Good," Mara said, "then you will not overcomplicate it." So the traveller knelt beside the thyme. At first they worked too quickly. The soil scattered. Mara reached over and set one small plant upright with 2 fingers. "Slower," she said. The traveller tried again. This time they placed the cutting in the little hollow, gathered soil around it, and pressed. The plant held. Like that? Like that. They worked side by side. There was no need to talk. The task was plain enough to fill the hands and gentle enough to leave the mind alone. After several minutes, the traveller began to breathe with the rhythm of the work. The moon crossed the fountain basin. Scoop, place, press. Somewhere beyond the wall, a cow shifted in a field and gave a low, sleepy sound. The traveller paused to listen. "That is Bera," Mara said. "You know the cow by voice? She complains at the same hour every night." The traveller smiled. "And the garden?" "The garden complains more quietly." "What does it say?" Mara leaned back on her heels and looked over the beds. "Usually it says the same things. Too much sun. Not enough water. Move this stone. Stop stepping there. Wait." "Wait?" "Most of all, wait." The traveller looked down at the thyme. "I am not very good at that. Few people are until something teaches them." The old bull stood under the trees, the moonlight now resting across its shoulders. Ivy covered one flank. A pear had fallen near its front hoof and split gently in the grass. Mara picked up the copper watering can and filled it from the rain barrel. "People think it means refusing to move," she said. "That is not the heart of it." She tipped the can, and water ran dark around the thyme roots. The heart of it is keeping faith with what grows slowly. The traveller was quiet. Mara continued along the row. Bread needs time. Fruit needs time. A room becomes home because someone returns to it again and again. Even rest takes time. You make a place where it can come, and then you let it come. The traveller pressed the last cutting into place. And if it does not, then the place is still better than it was. The wind came softly over the wall, then carrying the smell of wet stone and lavender. The candle in Mara's lantern bent low and rose again. I thought I needed to decide everything tonight, the traveller said. Mara set down the watering can. That is a heavy thing to bring into a garden. It followed me. Most heavy things do until they are given somewhere to sit. The traveller looked at the bench. Can decisions sit on benches? If bags can, why not decisions? This time the traveller laughed more easily. They returned to the bench and placed their small bag beside them. Then, after a moment, they placed one hand on top of it, as if asking it to stay there quietly. Mara went to the pear trees. There were 3 ripe pears in the grass. She gathered them into her apron and brought them to the fountain. With her small knife, she cut one into slices and handed a piece to the traveller. The pear was cool and grainy and sweet. They ate without speaking. Above the wall, clouds moved away from the moon. The garden brightened. The old bull looked almost warm, though it was only stone. Its lowered head faced the thyme beds, the fountain, the pear trees, and the 2 figures sitting quietly in the court. She only cut another pear slice and set it on the bench between them. The fountain dripped again. The traveller leaned back. I think I can walk to the inn now. You can, Mara said, but neither of them moved. There was no hurry. The inn would keep its lamps. The night would keep its moon. After a while, Mara rose and went to the old bull. She pulled a little ivy away from its shoulder where the leaves had grown too thick. The stone beneath was pale, almost blue in the moonlight. The traveller came to stand beside her. May I touch it? Gently. The traveller placed one hand on the stone bull's side. It was cool at first. Then, beneath the coolness, it seemed to hold the memory of the day. Not warmth exactly, more like sun stored deep where the night could not take it all at once. The traveller closed their eyes. Mara watched the garden around them. The thyme had been planted. The water had sunk in. The pear trees were still. Nothing had been solved. Nothing had been forced into shape. But something had settled. That was enough. When the traveller finally lifted their hand, their face had softened. Thank you, they said, for the pear, for the bench, and the thyme, and not asking too much. Mara nodded. The garden asks enough. She walked them to the gate. The road beyond it was darker than the garden, but not as dark as it had seemed before. The village lamps were visible now, small and steady below the hill. The traveller lifted their bag. Across the bridge and down by the mill? Yes. And tomorrow? Tomorrow the thyme will still be here. The traveller looked back once at the beds, the fountain, and the stone bull under the pear trees. That helps, they said. Then they went down the road. Mara stood at the gate until their footsteps faded. She did not close it. She returned to the thyme bed and checked each new plant one more time. A few needed more soil. One needed another sip of water. Most were fine. By then, the moon had moved beyond the pear branches. Mara gathered her tools. She folded the cloth around the heel of bread. She lowered the lantern flame until it was no brighter than a coal. Before leaving, she crossed the court and rested her hand for a moment on the stone bull's back. Still here, she said. The bull said nothing. The garden did not need it to. The thyme slept in its new bed. The pear trees held their fruit. The fountain kept a small piece of moon in its basin. And beyond the wall, the road curved toward the village, where a tired traveller would soon find a room, a lamp, and a bed that had been waiting without hurry. That was Taurus in the moonlit garden. Not the refusal to move, the promise to remain. Not the need to own the earth, the patience to care for one small piece of it. And long after the gate had fallen quiet, the old bull stood beneath the pear trees, holding the last warmth of the day in its stone side, while the garden breathed slowly around it. At the place where two narrow roads met, just as the light began to lean gold and then grey, stood a post house with blue shutters and a lantern already lit over the door. The lantern was lit early on purpose. It was the last mark the road gave before the village proper, and travellers had come to expect it there before dusk had fully settled, the way you expect a familiar face at a window. One road ran east along the canal, low and quiet between its reed banks. The other climbed west, past garden walls and drying wash, up toward the dark shoulder of the hill. Between the two, the village sat in its evening hush, roofs going soft-edged in the fading light, chimneys beginning to smoke. Inside, the post-house smelled of paper, wax, and rain-damp wool. Shelves ran along every wall, holding letters in small wooden trays, string in coils, a jar of sealing wax gone soft near the warm side of the stove. 2 rain-cloaks hung by the door, still faintly damp from the afternoon shower that had come and gone before supper. Ivo and Seren worked the evening sort together, though they worked it differently. Ivo remembered faces. He could tell you, without looking twice, which letter belonged to the miller's wife and which belonged to her sister, though the 2 women wrote in almost the same hand. He kept his sleeves rolled to the elbow even in cool weather, and he sorted with his left hand while his right hand rested lightly on the counter, as if it were listening for something the eyes might miss. Seren remembered roads. She could walk a path in the full dark by the shape of it alone, the exact place where the ditch narrowed, the exact bend where the hedge grew wild and caught at a sleeve. She wore her hair tied back with a strip of the same cloth every evening, and she always checked the sky before stepping out, not for weather so much as for the particular grey that told her how much light the lane would still hold by the time she reached its far end. Between them, very little needed to be said. They had long ago worked out which letters wanted which feet. Most evenings went the same shape. One twin took the canal, the other took the lane, and they met part way through at the bridge, the one solid crossing point between the 2 halves of the village. Then they walked whatever remained together, since the last letters of an evening were usually the ones that needed 2 sets of eyes rather than one. It was not a rule anyone had written down. It was only how the walking had settled, over enough evenings that neither of them thought to walk it any other way. Tonight there were 7 letters in the evening bag. A recipe, folded twice, meant for a cousin 2 lanes over. A birthday note written in a careful, unpracticed hand. A map that had been torn and mended with thread, returning to the surveyor who had lost it in the spring flood. A pressed flower, sealed flat inside a folded paper, addressed only with initials. 2 ordinary notices bound for the mill, and 1 letter, plain and a little worn at the corners, that carried no name and no street at all. It only said, "To the house where the lamp is left on." Ivo turned it over twice, the way he always did with anything unusual, then set it aside without comment. There would be time for it later, once the dark had properly settled. The other 6 could not wait that long. He took 3 letters and stepped out first, toward the canal. The path there ran low and quiet behind the post house, the water dark and moving without much sound. Ivo liked this route at dusk. The reeds along the bank made a soft, continuous whisper, and every so often a moorhen shifted somewhere unseen and went still again, as if remembering itself. He delivered the recipe first, at a cottage with a crooked chimney, where the cousin took it at the door, still wiping flour from her hands, and said only, "Ah, good," before disappearing back inside, already thinking of supper and the smell of butter already rising behind her. Then the mill notices, left with the miller's boy, who barely looked up from stacking sacks in the last of the daylight. Beyond the mill, where the path rose slightly to meet the bridge, Ivo caught sight of a small shape moving along the far hillside lane, pale against the darker hedges. Seren, already well into her own round, he lifted a hand without thinking. She may or may not have seen it. Neither of them needed to know for certain. The bridge over the canal was old stone, narrow enough for one cart at a time, with a low parapet worn smooth by generations of hands resting there to watch the water. Ivo paused there, as he always did, and looked down at the last of the light moving on the surface in long, unhurried streaks, breaking apart wherever something small stirred beneath it. While Ivo crossed the canal path, Seren had taken the lane on the far side of the village, climbing gently as it went, past low garden walls and a row of drying wash already dampened again by the evening air. Somewhere below and behind her, she thought she saw Ivo's shape pause near the water, small and steady, and she let her eyes rest on it for only a moment before the lane bent and hid the canal from view. The lane smelled of turned earth and drying hay, and somewhere off to the side a hen settled into its coop with a low, grumbling sound before falling quiet. A late bee moved heavily between two rows of lavender, in no hurry to find its hive before dark. Seren walked at the same steady pace she always kept on this stretch, letting the rhythm of her own steps settle the last of the day out of her shoulders. She carried the birthday note first, to a farmhouse where a girl of perhaps 10 opened the door before Seren had finished knocking, as though she had been listening for footsteps since supper. Seren handed it over and said only, "Happy birthday, from your uncle," and the girl held it against her chest with both hands before running back inside, already calling for someone to come and see. The mended map went next, to the surveyor's house near the top of the lane, where an old man took it at the door, unfolded it part way under the porch light, and nodded slowly at the sight of the thread holding it together. "Careful hands," he said. "Careful roads," Seren answered, and that was enough for both of them. The pressed flower she saved for last, since it belonged to no clear house, only initials, and she wanted whatever daylight remained in her memory of the lane to be sure she matched them correctly. She found the right gate at last, half hidden behind a hedge grown taller than the fence, and left the flower tucked where a hand would find it without a knock being necessary. By the time she reached the bridge, the sky had gone the colour of a doused coal, orange fading into grey, with the first true stars showing faint above the hill's dark shoulder. Ivo was still there, leaning on the parapet, watching the water go from gold to slate. They did not need to compare their bags. 3 letters gone, 3 letters gone. Both of them looked down at the canal for a moment, the reflected light narrowing into threads, then scattering wherever a fish or a current moved beneath the surface. It was always like this at the bridge, whatever the season. Whoever arrived first simply waited, unbothered, and whoever arrived second never needed to explain why they had taken as long as they had. The bridge did not care which road either of them had come from. It only held them both, briefly, before letting them go on together. "One left," Ivo said. "The lamp house," Seren said. Neither of them knew whose window that was. The post house kept no map of houses with a lamp left on, only streets and family names, and this letter carried none of those. So they walked back toward the village together, the one remaining letter held loosely between them, and let their eyes do the searching instead of their memory. Windows had begun to light all through the village as the evening thickened. A kitchen window with a woman moving back and forth before a stove, a pot lid clinking somewhere inside. A shop-front window already shuttered for the night, one thin line of lamplight showing beneath the door. A nursery window with a single low candle and no other light at all, the shape of a cradle just visible against the wall. None of these were the house they were looking for. A lamp left on for a stranger meant something different than a lamp simply lit for supper or for putting a child to sleep. It meant a window that stayed patient long after the rest of the house had gone quiet around it, waiting the way the post-house lantern waited, but for someone in particular rather than for anyone at all. They walked the lane slowly, past a well with its bucket resting, past a dog that lifted its head once and settled again, past a garden gate that creaked once in the rising evening wind. Smoke was rising now from most chimneys, thin and pale against the darker sky, and somewhere a door closed with the soft, final sound of a house settling in for the night. The bakery had gone dark an hour before, its ovens still breathing warmth through the shut door. A cart stood empty outside the smithy, its wheels caked with the day's dust, waiting for morning. Ivo and Seren passed all of it slowly, unhurried, the way the evening itself seemed unhurried, and each window that turned out not to be theirs felt like a small, private relief rather than a disappointment. They found it at last at the edge of the village, where the last lane curved gently up toward the hill, past gardens gone quiet for the season, and a gate that hung a little loose on its hinge. The window was small, set high in an old stone cottage, and the lamp inside burned low and steady, the kind of flame that had clearly been trimmed with care and left to wait rather than lit in a hurry. Ivo and Seren stood together at the gate for a moment, both certain without needing to say so. Seren knocked. The woman who answered was older, grey-haired, wrapped in a shawl the colour of moss. She had the unhurried manner of someone long used to answering doors at odd hours, and she looked at the two messengers with polite curiosity rather than surprise. "We have a letter," Seren said. "It has no name, only that it's meant for the house where the lamp is left on." The woman's face changed slightly, softening around the eyes. "That would be mine," she said. She took the letter with both hands, the way Ivo had noticed people sometimes did with things they had been waiting for without quite admitting it to themselves. "I used to teach the children in this village," she said, mostly to herself, turning the letter over once. "For years I left a lamp on so any of them, grown now and travelling, would know which house was still awake if they ever needed a room for the night or simply someone to talk to." She did not open the letter in front of them. She only held it and thanked them plainly, the way people thank you for something ordinary that happens to matter more than it looks. "Rest well tonight," she said, "and thank the postmaster for me, whoever that may be this season." "We will," Ivo said. They said their good nights and turned back down the lane. Behind them, the lamp remained exactly as it had been, patient in its small window, and neither of them looked back to check that it still burned. They already knew it would. By the time they reached the post house again, the first real rain of the evening had begun, a light, steady kind that darkened the road without hurry and beaded along the shoulders of their cloaks. They hung the cloaks by the stove, side by side, the way they always did. The unsent letters for tomorrow slept in their trays, already sorted by road though not yet by hand, waiting for the next dusk to carry them out the same door, over the same bridge, up the same lane, the whole quiet round beginning again as if it had never stopped. The lantern over the door burned low, ready for whoever might need it before the night was through. Neither twin said much more. There was nothing that needed saying. The recipe had reached its cousin. The birthday note had reached the girl who ran with it held to her chest. The map had reached careful hands. The flower had reached its hedge. and the letter with no name had reached the one window in the village that had been waiting, quietly, for exactly this. That was Gemini at dusk. Not clever talk, not quick wit traded like a game. Only two quiet roots, crossing and crossing again at the same worn bridge, carrying small ordinary things exactly where they belonged. The tide house stood where the shore bent inward, in a small hollow between black rocks and pale sand, with one lantern burning in the upper window before the last colour had left the sky. It was not a lighthouse. It was too small for that, and its light did not turn in a grand circle over the sea. It was only a house with a strong roof, a stone hearth, and a window facing the narrow water where fishing boats returned in evening mist. Still, everyone along that coast knew the steady amber square above the rocks. Inside, the house was built for weather without making a great show of it. Hooks lined the wall near the door, ready for wet coats. A long bench held folded blankets, each one brushed clean and kept dry in cedar-scented chests during the day. Boots stood in a careful row on flat stones near the hearth. Shells dried in shallow trays along the sill, pale and brown and faintly pink, each one turned open to the warmth. A kettle sat at the edge of the fire, and beside it a pot of broth breathed quietly beneath its lid. Nessa kept the tide house. She was not old, though the house made her seem older because she moved with the calm of someone who had learned not to hurry near the sea. Her hair was pinned back with two plain combs. Around her neck she wore a small key to the lantern room above, though in truth the door was rarely locked. Every evening, before the lamps in the village were lit and before the fishing boats turned home, Nessa climbed the narrow stairs to the upper room. She carried a cloth, a tin of oil, and a small box of matches. She cleaned the lantern glass first, turning it slowly in her hands until the day's salt had gone from it, and the wick showed clear behind the pane. Then she filled the cup, trimmed the blackened thread, struck one match, and held the flame steady until the lantern took it. The light always seemed small at first. It trembled like any other flame, thin and newly made. Then the glass gathered it, and the room accepted it, and the window set it out over the water. That was the first duty of the house. The second duty was quieter. It was the pot on the hearth, the folded wool, the dry socks warming on a chair back, the low table wiped clean before anyone arrived to need it. Nessa had learned that people came in from the shore carrying more than weather. The tide house did not ask them to explain which kind. It offered the same simple things either way. That evening the sea was calm in its own heavy manner. Small waves lifted and folded against the rocks with a soft dragging sound, not loud enough to trouble the house, but steady enough that silence inside was never empty. Beyond the inlet, the water had begun to darken from blue to pewter. Farther out, two late boats moved with their sails lowered, each one leaving a narrow crease behind it. Nessa stood in the open doorway for a moment after lighting the upper lantern. She listened to the tide beneath the pier. The water was turning inward. She could tell by the sound, by the way it came under the boards, and touched the posts with a rounded knock instead of a scrape. The shore kept time in many ways. Bells were useful. Clocks were useful. But the tide had its own slow hand, and she had learned to feel where it pointed. When she went back inside, she added a little more wood to the fire. Rain began just after that, soft at first, stitching the darkening air between the house and the rocks. It made the roof whisper. It dotted the window glass. It turned the path from the village into a darker ribbon, glossy where the stones showed through the sand. Nessa did not look worried. Rain came. Rain went. The sea kept breathing through both. She set a bowl on the table, then another, though she had not heard anyone on the path. She placed a spoon beside each bowl, checked the folded blankets with one hand, and moved a pair of thick grey socks closer to the hearth. Only after all that did a knock come at the lower door. It was a tired knock, not urgent. 3 careful taps, followed by a pause, as if the person outside had almost decided not to disturb the house after all. Nessa opened the door. A traveller stood there with rain shining on the shoulders of their coat. Their hat had lost its shape. Their boots were dark to the ankle, and one hand held the strap of a small bag as if holding it gave them a place to put the last of their effort. They were not frightened. They were only wet, chilled, and worn down by the long grey patience of the road. "Come in," Nessa said. That was all. The traveller stepped inside, and the house took them in by degrees. First came the change in sound, rain outside, fire inside. Then the smell of broth, onion, bay leaf, and a little pepper. Then the warmth around the ankles, then the shoulders, then the face. The traveller stood on the flat stones near the door and let water fall from the hem of the coat in small dark spots. Nessa helped the coat from their shoulders and hung it on the nearest hook. She took the hat and set it upside down on the bench. She did not fuss. She did not ask where they had been or why they had chosen the shore road so late in the day. She only pointed to the chair near the fire where the grey socks waited. "Those should fit well enough," she said. The traveller sat. For a moment they seemed almost too tired to bend toward their boots. Nessa placed a low stool before them. Wet leather gave way. Cold socks came off. Warm wool went on. The traveller looked down at their own feet as if they belonged to someone who had been kindly returned. "Thank you," they said. Nessa nodded and ladled broth into the first bowl. Steam rose between them. It was not a grand meal. It did not need to be. There were soft potatoes in it, and strips of carrot, and a little barley that had opened until it was tender. The traveller held the bowl in both hands before taking the spoon, letting the heat move into their palms. Outside, the rain thickened and then softened again. The lantern upstairs burned without changing. For a while, the only talk in the room belonged to the house. The fire settled. The kettle clicked. One shell near the sill shifted as a thread of water dried from its edge. A rope outside brushed against the pier post and fell back. Under all of it, the tide lifted slowly, coming in beneath the boards, touching stone, gathering itself for the night. Nessa moved quietly through the room, putting the traveller's wet things where they would dry without scorching. She spread the coat over 2 hooks instead of 1. She set the boots on their sides near the hearthstones. She took the small bag and placed it on the bench within reach, not opening it, not moving it farther than necessary. The house had its manners. A person could be welcomed without being searched. When the traveller had finished half the bowl, their shoulders lowered. It was a small change, but the house noticed small changes. The chair creaked as they leaned back. The spoon slowed. Their eyes moved around the room with the gentler gaze of someone learning where they were. They saw the shells on the sill. Some were ordinary shore shells, smooth from sand and tide. Some were broken in such clean ways that the inside showed a pearly gleam. One was no bigger than a fingernail, striped like a tiny field after rain. Another curled inward on itself, holding its own hush at the center. "Do they belong to anyone?" the traveller asked. "Some do," Nessa said. "Most belonged to the water first." The traveller smiled a little and took another spoonful of broth. There was no need to say more about it. Later, when the bowl was empty and a cup of tea had replaced it, Nessa climbed the stairs once more to check the lantern. The traveller did not follow. They stayed by the fire, wrapped now in one of the folded blankets, listening to the boards above give one soft creak, then another. The house was simple enough that every movement within it could be known. The stairs, the upper room, the small catch on the lantern window, the return of the latch. From where they sat, the traveller could see the lower window and the rain beyond it. The glass was black except where the fire made a faint red reflection. Every now and then a drop ran crookedly down the outside pane, catching the light for a breath before joining the darkness below. The sea did not look like much from that chair, only a moving shadow past the sill, a little paler where the rain touched it, but it made itself known in sound. Water under the pier, water between rocks, water pulling back through loose shells. The traveller listened until the sounds no longer seemed separate. Rain, tide, kettle, breath, fire. They made one low room of sound, and the room held. When Nessa came back down, she carried a tray of shells that had finished drying. She sat at the table and began placing them in rows by touch more than sight. Whole shells in one line, broken shells in another, pieces of driftwood in a shallow bowl. "Why keep the broken ones?" the traveller asked after a while. Nessa looked at the row before answering. "Because they sound different when the tide moves them." She lifted one small broken shell and set it gently near the traveller's cup. Whole shells hold the sea one way, broken shells let it pass through. The traveller touched the shell with one finger. Its edge had been softened by sand. There was no sharpness left in it. Outside, a bell sounded once from the far pier. Not a warning, only the harbour mark in the rain, telling any late boat where the turn began. The sound came through the walls low and round, then faded into the roof whisper. Nessa rose and opened the upper half of the Dutch door. Cool air entered, threaded with salt and wet stone. The traveller pulled the blanket closer, but not from discomfort. A little cold at the edge of warmth made the warmth clearer. Out beyond the inlet, one small boat moved slowly past the rocks. It was not struggling. Its sail was down, its oars dipping evenly. The lantern in the upper window laid a soft colour on the rain, enough for the rower to keep the right line through the narrow water. The boat passed, left a widening ripple, and went on toward the village mooring where other low lights waited. The traveller had nearly fallen asleep and did not see it. Nessa watched until the boat had turned safely inside the harbour curve. Then she closed the door, set the latch, and lowered the kettle farther from the hottest part of the fire. The house settled again. After a time, she brought out a narrow cot from the room beside the hearth. It folded down with a familiar wooden sigh. She laid one blanket over it, then another at the foot. The traveller stood to help, but Nessa shook her head gently. "You can take the morning road," she said. "It is kinder after sleep." The traveller seemed to consider saying they had not meant to stay. The words rose and faded. The house made no demand of them, and because of that, staying felt only like answering the weather honestly. "Morning then," they said. They lay down with their face turned toward the fire. The room grew slower. Firelight moved along the ceiling beams. Rain made a soft silver pattern on the window. In the upper room, the lantern burned where it had been placed, sending its patient square of light across the inlet. Now and then, the tide touched the pier posts with that rounded sound Nessa had heard earlier, fuller now, closer to the top of the rocks. Nessa washed the bowls and set them upside down to dry. She folded the unused socks back over the chair. She turned the boots once so the damp would leave both sides evenly. She covered the broth and banked the fire. The traveller slept before the last of these small tasks was done. Their breathing became part of the house. Not louder than the rain, not softer than the tide, only another steady thing the room accepted. Nessa paused near the hearth and listened, not as a guard, not as a nurse, but as someone making sure the night had found its proper shape. Then she climbed once more to the lantern room. Upstairs, the windows were wet with rain, and the sea beyond them had lost its edges. The lantern glass was warm. Its flame leaned slightly, then straightened. Nessa set one hand near it without touching, feeling the heat in the air. Below, the traveller slept. Beyond the rocks, the harbour held its boats. Behind the tide house, the shore road waited in the dark, washed clean for morning. Nessa looked out for a little while. The sea was not gentle because it was small. It was not safe because it was still. It was simply itself, breathing in and out against the stones, and the house beside it answered in the only way a house could answer, with light, with soup, with dry wool, with a door that opened when someone knocked softly after rain. When she came back down, the hearth had sunk into red coals. The room was dim enough for sleep and warm enough for dreaming. The shells on the sill had gone quiet. The traveller's wet coat hung open, already giving back the road's cold drop by drop. The lantern above kept shining through the rain, not loudly, not far, only steadily enough for the water, the window, and the night. That was Cancer by the tide, not a mood that rises and falls without reason, not a shell closed against the world, only a small warm house that remembered how to receive the rain, the traveller, the boat, and the dark, and keep a light for each of them until morning. After midnight, when the last guest had gone and the courtyard stones had stopped carrying footsteps, the Golden Hall became itself again. It was not silent all at once. Rooms rarely are. First came the closing of the outer doors, one after another, with the soft weight of old wood returning to its frame. Then came the fading of wheels on the road beyond the gate. Then a few low voices in the passage, a laugh remembered rather than begun, the clink of one forgotten glass being set down by someone who had almost carried it outside. After that, the hall listened to its own small sounds and let the celebration sink into the walls. The room was long and warm, built of dark beams, honey-coloured stone, and windows so tall they held a little of the night even with the curtains drawn. Velvet chairs stood in loose half-circles where people had moved them during the evening. A long table ran down the centre, no longer grand, only useful, with crumbs on the linen and empty cups gathered in small groups like tired guests of their own. Low candles burned in iron branches along the walls. Some flames were still bright. Some had bent almost to blue. Above the great hearth, carved into a shield of old oak, was the lion crest of the hall, its mane worn smooth where generations of firelight had touched it. Orin began at the far end, as he always did. He was the hall steward, though he never used the title unless someone else needed it. He knew which chair leg had a soft wobble, which window latch stuck in damp weather, which silver cup had a faint mark near the rim, and should not be sent to the front of the table when strangers came. He knew how many candles were needed for winter, how many for harvest, how many for the spring feast when the room wanted more air than glow. He kept the hall not by ruling it, but by remembering it. Tonight he carried a tray under one arm and a snuffer in his right hand. He moved slowly down the table, gathering cups, folding napkins, touching each chair back so it sat straight again. When he reached a candle, he looked at it first. A candle still burning cleanly was allowed its last few minutes. A candle guttering into smoke was put gently out. The hall did not need brightness anymore. It needed warmth and enough light to make leaving peaceful. There had been music earlier. The kind that lifted toward the rafters and made the high windows seem less like glass than like dark water holding stars. There had been viols and a small pipe, one drum brushed softly rather than struck, and a young musician with a wooden case who had stood near the hearth because the room was large and the hearth made the hands easier to trust. Now, most of the musicians had gone with the guests. One had not. Orin noticed them only after he had cleared half the table. They sat in the shadow beside the great fireplace, not quite hidden, not quite ready to be seen. Their instrument case lay open across their knees, lined with faded blue cloth. The instrument itself, a narrow stringed thing of pale wood, rested inside as if sleeping. The musicians' hands were folded over the edge of the case. They were young, though not so young that anyone would have said so aloud, and there was a tiredness in their face that did not belong only to the hour. Orin did not cross the room immediately. He finished stacking 3 cups on the tray. He set aside a bent spoon for polishing later. He straightened one chair that had been left turned toward the hearth. Only then did he walk over, giving the musician time to decide whether they wanted to vanish into the corridor before he arrived. They stayed. "The fire is still yours for a while," Orin said. The musician looked up as if the words had reached them from a longer distance than the hearth allowed. "I should go," they said. "Soon," Orin answered. He set the tray on a sideboard, took the kettle from its hook, and poured hot water over leaves in a brown pot. The hall always had tea after a feast. Not for ceremony, for hands that had worked, for throats that had spoken too much, for anyone who discovered after midnight that going out into the cold required one more quiet minute. The musician closed the instrument case halfway, then left it open again. Orin brought 2 cups to the hearth and set one on the small table near them. He did not ask if the music had gone well. The question was too narrow for the look on the musician's face. They wrapped both hands around the cup, but did not drink. "It is strange," they said after a while, "how a room can be full of listening, and still you cannot tell whether you have given it anything." Orin took the chair on the other side of the hearth. It was a plain chair, kept there for menders, fire tenders, and late guests with aching feet. He sat with one elbow on the arm and looked toward the long table, where the candles made small pools of gold along the linen. "Rooms are not quick to answer," he said. The musician gave a faint smile, then looked down into the tea. Outside, wind moved lightly along the roofline. It was not strong enough to shake the shutters. It only reminded the hall that the night beyond the curtains was cool and wide. Inside, the fire had settled into a lower burn. Orange moved under the logs. Ash glowed at the edges. The lion crest above the hearth looked less like a symbol now, and more like a piece of old wood keeping company with the room. Orin let the quiet stand. He had learned, over many years of tending the hall, that tired people often needed the first silence more than the first answer. A feast was full of offers, food offered, songs offered, hands offered in greeting, praise offered in passing, bright and brief. But after all that, when the doors closed and the lamps lowered, a person might need a silence that did not ask anything back. The musician took one sip of tea. "I missed a note in the second song," they said. "Perhaps," Orin said. "You heard it?" "I heard the second song." The musician looked at him then, uncertain whether he had avoided the question by kindness or by habit. Orin lifted his cup. "I also heard the old carpenter at the west table stop talking for the first time all evening. I heard the children near the pillar sit down on the floor because they did not want to leave. I heard someone in the doorway hum the tune after you finished." The musician's hands tightened once around the cup, then loosened. That was all Orin said about it. A grand speech would have filled the room too much. The hall was nearly asleep. It wanted low words. He rose and returned to his work, leaving the second chair turned toward the fire. The musician stayed, listening now in a different way. As Orin moved down the table, the hall gave back small pieces of the evening. A ribbon of melody seemed to remain near the rafters, not as magic, not as sound exactly, but as the memory of sound in a place made to hold it. A chair creaked where someone had leaned back, laughing. The boards near the center of the floor gave one soft sigh under Orin's step, the same boards that had held dancers earlier, circling without haste. Near the windows, a curtain moved as the house settled, and candlelight ran across its folds like dull gold poured slowly from a cup. The musician rose at last and began to close the case properly. They took a cloth from the inner pocket and wiped the strings. They loosened one peg by a careful turn. They tucked the bow into its narrow place and drew the blue lining over the pale wood. Every motion was tender, the way people touch tools that have carried them through a long night. When the latches clicked shut, the sound was small but certain. Orin was at the sideboard then, pouring the last inch of wine from 3 abandoned cups into a kitchen jar. Nothing in the hall was wasted if it could still serve some quiet purpose. Candle ends became fire starters. Flowers from the table went to the window sills in the servants' rooms. Bread crusts went to the morning birds. Even wax drippings, once cooled, were saved in a tin until there was enough to mend a taper. The musician carried the case to the hearth and stood before the lion crest. "Has that always been there?" they asked. "Longer than I have," Orin said. "It looks different now. Most things do after midnight." The musician studied the carved lion. In the full feast light it must have looked bold, perhaps even stern, with its lifted head and open mane. Now, with only the low hearth beneath it, the crest seemed calmer. The lion did not appear to guard treasure or command a room. It seemed to watch over the cups waiting to be washed, the chairs waiting to be set right, the person finishing tea beside the fire. Its strength had become a quieter thing. Orin took up the snuffer again. Together, without quite deciding to, they moved through the hall in the same direction. Orin put out the candles that had burned low enough. The musician followed at a little distance, carrying their case in one hand and their tea in the other. At each window, the glass gave back a faint image of the room. Table, chairs, candles, dark beams, the two of them passing like slow reflections through honey-coloured light. There was no applause now. No one looked toward the hearth. No one waited for a song. The musician's steps became softer because the room was softer. By the time they reached the far end, their shoulders had come down from the careful place where they had held them all evening. Orin opened the inner door to the passage. Beyond it, the kitchen lamps were low, and someone had left a loaf under a cloth for morning. The smell of baked crust still held in the air, mixed with wood smoke and lemon peel from the washing basin. Orin placed the tray of cups near the sink. He did not begin washing them yet. Some could wait for long to the very late night. Some could wait for dawn. The musicians stood in the passage with the case against their side. "I thought I wanted the room to notice me," they said. Orin looked back toward the hall. "Maybe you wanted the room to receive what you brought." The musician considered this. It seemed to sit more easily in them than the first version. They nodded once. Rain had not come that night, but the air outside had turned damp. When Orin opened the outer door, the courtyard smelled of stone, sleeping ivy, and the faint smoke of distant chimneys. The eastern edge of the sky was not light yet, but the black had thinned. Somewhere beyond the gate, a cartwheel settled with a wooden tick as the air cooled around it. The musician stepped to the threshold, then paused. "Will the hall remember it?" they asked. Orin did not answer quickly. He looked back at the long room, the low candles, the straightened chairs, the lion crest above the hearth. He looked at the table where crumbs still marked the places people had sat close together. He looked at the floorboards that had carried every song without keeping one for themselves. "The hall remembers by making room for the next song," he said. The musician's face changed then, not brightly, not suddenly, but with the small easing of someone setting down a weight they had carried without naming it. "Good night," they said. "Good morning, nearly," Orin replied. They went out across the courtyard with the case held close and their steps careful on the stones. At the gate they turned once, not toward Orin, but toward the upper windows of the hall. No candle showed there now except the last glow near the hearth. It was enough. They lifted one hand, then passed through the gate and into the pale edge of morning. Orin closed the door softly. The hall had one more hour before daylight reached it fully. He used that hour slowly. He gathered the last cups. He folded the linen back from the table's edge. He brushed crumbs into his palm and carried them to the sill for the birds. He returned each chair to its proper place, not in stiff rows, but with a little space between them, as if the room might need to breathe before another day began. When only the hearth remained, Orin stood before it and looked up. The lion crest was almost dark. The fire below had settled into red and black. Yet in the grain of the oak, in the worn curve of the mane, some warmth still seemed to stay. Orin touched the mantle with 2 fingers, the way he did at the end of every long night. Not a ritual anyone had taught him, only a habit of thanks. Then he crossed to the tall eastern window and drew one curtain back. Morning had not arrived in gold yet. It came first in grey, then pearl, then the faintest line of honey above the outer wall. The light entered quietly and found what the candles had left. Polished wood, empty cups turned upside down, one ribbon forgotten under a chair, the smooth floor where dancers had moved. Last of all, it reached the crest over the hearth and touched the lion's mane. The old wood warmed by degrees. That was Leo after midnight. Not a hunger to be seen, not the bright hour of applause. Only a quiet hall keeping its warmth after the music had ended, so that anyone who had given something of themselves could leave a little steadier than when they came. The Library of Quiet Stars stood at the highest edge of the old town, where the roofs fell away below it, and the night sky could be seen through a glass ceiling washed clean by rain. It was not a large library from the outside. A person passing in daylight might have noticed only a stone building with a green door, narrow windows, and 3 shallow steps worn smooth at the centre. But at night, when the lamps were turned low and the glass roof held the sky above the reading room, the place seemed deeper than its walls. Shelves rose into shadow. Ladders waited on brass rails. Cedar drawers lined the far side of the room, each one holding star maps, folded charts, and thin papers that had learned the shape of careful hands. The public rooms had closed hours earlier. Outside, the town had lowered itself into sleep. A cart stood covered in the square. A baker's window showed one dull ember behind the grate. Farther down the hill, a dog barked once and then seemed to remember the hour. The library took all of that distance into itself, not shutting the town away, only holding it gently beyond the green door. Now the library belonged to Sela, the night librarian, and to the soft order that came after use. Not the stiff order of untouched things. A better order than that. The kind made by books returned after being read, pencils sharpened for the next morning, lamps turned down one by one, and chairs eased back under tables so no one would meet them sharply in the dark. Selah began at the front desk. She was small in the way quiet people sometimes seem small before you notice how much of a room they know. Her grey apron had 2 deep pockets. One held a soft brush, a short pencil, and a bone folder polished by years of use. The other held slips of paper, a cotton cloth, and a little tin of paste for loose corners. Her hair was pinned simply. Her glasses hung on a chain and were used only when the print demanded it. Most of the library she could read by touch and placement alone. First, she stacked the returned books by floor and shelf, travel records to the east wall, weather ledgers to the case near the globe, poetry to the low shelf beside the blue chair, because readers who came for poetry often sat down before they meant to and needed the books within reach. Astronomy remained on the central table for a little longer. The star readers were always the last to leave, and they often left softly, as if coming back from a great distance. Beside the astronomy books lay 3 pencils worn blunt by the evening's notes. Sailor sharpened them over a folded scrap of paper. The shavings curled lightly, pale wood against graphite dust. She sharpened slowly, just enough. A pencil did not need to be made new. It only needed to be ready. When she was done, she brushed the dust into the paper, folded it once, and emptied it into the little bin beneath the desk. The green lamps along the tables burned with a quiet, steady light. Their shades made circles on the polished wood, and inside each circle were the traces of the day. A card turned slightly askew, a bookmark forgotten between pages, a faint crescent of water left by a cup that should not have been there but had been forgiven. Sailor wiped the mark with the cotton cloth until it disappeared into the grain. Above her, through the glass roof, the first clear stars had come out. The rain had ended before closing. Drops still clung to the roof panels, and every star beyond them trembled slightly, not because the stars moved, but because the water held and released them in small pieces. Sailor looked up only briefly. There was time for the sky. There was also a room asking, quietly, to be put back into peace. She moved down the first aisle with a small cart. The wheels made almost no sound. On the top shelf of the cart sat the books that needed returning before morning. On the lower shelf lay a stack of catalogue cards tied with string, a jar of clean labels, and one old sky atlas with its binding wrapped in linen. Sailor had set the atlas aside earlier when a reader brought it to the desk and said, apologetically, that something seemed loose inside. There had been no blame in the matter. Old books loosened the way old houses settled. They only needed someone patient enough to notice. At the end of the aisle, near the table where mapmakers usually worked, Sailor saw the loose page. It had slipped behind the desk and come to rest against the wall, half hidden in shadow. She knelt without hurry and drew it out with 2 fingers, holding it by the cleanest edge. The paper was thick and cream-coloured, with a faint blue chart printed across it. A corner had folded inward. A line of small numbers ran along the side. In the margin, written in brown ink by a hand long gone, were 3 words. For winter skies. Sailor smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was the sort of note that made a library feel less like storage and more like a chain of people being careful across time. She carried the page back to the desk and laid it on a clean blotter. Then she took the soft brush from her pocket and moved it across the paper in short, light strokes. Dust lifted. A grain of sand, somehow brought in from a shoe or a coat hem, rolled away from the crease. She unfolded the corner with the bone folder, smoothing it only as much as it wanted to be smoothed. Too much correction could become another kind of damage. The page belonged to the old sky atlas on the lower shelf of the cart. She knew it before checking, but she checked anyway. Care was not doubt. Care was how a thing was welcomed home. The atlas opened with a low, dry whisper. Its pages showed constellations in ink, faded almost to grey, each one surrounded by tiny notes, best seen after frost, low in the south, difficult near smoke, clearer after rain. Sailor turned the pages until she found the gap. There, between autumn and the deep winter section, the binding showed a narrow, pale line where the missing sheet had rested for many years. She did not paste it at once. First she placed the page where it belonged and let the book hold it loosely. Then she set 2 small weights at the corners and left it while she continued through the room. Some repairs needed a moment to settle before the hand decided what to do next. The library seemed to approve of this. It breathed in its quiet way. Wood cooled. Paper relaxed. A ladder gave one tiny click along its rail as the metal changed with the night air. Somewhere in the wall, a pipe answered the last warmth of the day with a small hollow tick, then went still. None of these sounds interrupted the room. They were the room, speaking under its breath. Sailor returned the travel records, then the weather ledgers, then the poetry. Each book had its place, but she never treated the places as severe. A shelf was not a command. It was an invitation for the next person to find what they came looking for. She slid each spine into line, leaving enough space for fingers, enough space for use. Order that could not be touched was not yet kindness. At the cedar drawers, she untied the string around the catalogue cards. The cards were small and cream-coloured, each one ruled in blue. Names, dates, shelf marks, cross-references. The architecture of finding. Sella sorted them by lamplight, moving each one into its drawer with a soft tap. One card pointed to a chart of the summer triangle, another to a record of a comet seen above the mill pond 40 years before, another to a child's copy of the moon, drawn in pencil, accepted into the local observations because the child had marked the date, the weather, and the time with unusual care. That card made Sella pause. The drawing was not in the drawer, of course. It was stored elsewhere, flat in a box. But the card held its door open in the mind. Anyone who found it later would be able to ask, and asking would bring the little moon back into the light. This was one of the library's deeper comforts. Not that everything was visible at once, but that things did not disappear simply because they were put away. Sailor closed the drawer with 2 fingers. The lamps were ready to be lowered now. She began with the tables farthest from the desk. At each lamp, she turned the small brass key until the green shade dimmed from bright leaf to moss to a low pool of amber at the center. The room changed by degrees. Shelves grew softer. The ceiling glass became more visible. The stars above seemed to gather themselves as the room made room for them. Only the desk lamp and the lamp beside the atlas remained bright. Sailor returned to the repair. The loose page had settled flat beneath its weights. She lifted one corner and placed the thinnest line of paste along the binding edge with a narrow brush. Then she breathed once, steadying her hand, and eased the page into place. It met the book without resistance. She pressed it with the bone folder, not hard, only firmly enough to say, "Here." Then she laid a strip of clean paper over the join and closed the atlas around it. For a moment, she rested her palm on the cover. The cover was dark blue, nearly black, with a title stamped so faintly it could only be read when the light approached from the side. The atlas had travelled through many desks, many winters, many hands. It had lost a page and found it again. That was enough for one night. Sailor wrote a small note for the morning librarian. Atlas repaired. Let rest until noon. She placed the note under the desk weight, shaped like a sleeping bird. There were still a few small things to do. There always were. She emptied the pencil tray of shavings. She capped the paste. She returned the brush to her apron pocket. She straightened the blue chair by the poetry shelf, then softened the straightness by turning it slightly toward the table, because a chair too square to the room looked less like an offer and more like a rule. At the far end of the reading room, the glass roof had cleared. No rain remained on the center panels now. The stars showed with a clean, distant steadiness. Sailor stood beneath them and looked up for longer this time. The sky did not look ordered in the same way the drawers were ordered. It did not stand in rows. It did not keep shelf marks. Yet the more a person learned it, the more pathways appeared. A bright star leading to a dimmer one. A curve of 3. a scatter that became a pattern only after the eyes grew patient. The sky was not tidy, it was findable. That was enough. Sella turned down the desk lamp. The room entered its final quiet. Not darkness, not yet. The lamp beside the repaired atlas still glowed low, and a little starlight fell through the roof. The cedar drawers held their folded maps. The catalogue cards rested in their boxes. The sharpened pencils waited in a straight, useful row. The old atlas lay closed, its returned page settling slowly back into the book. At the door, Sella paused and looked once more across the library. Nothing important announced itself. No secret shone. No hidden answer rose from the shelves. The peace of the room came from smaller completions. A book where it belonged. A page returned. A lamp lowered. A chair ready for whoever would arrive tomorrow carrying a question they might not yet know how to ask. She took the key from around her neck, though she did not need it for the inner rooms, and held it in her hand while she listened. The library answered with paper, wood, glass, and the faint sound of the town below settling into sleep. Then she closed the green door. Inside, the final lamp burned a little longer beside the atlas, as planned. Its light did not reach far. It touched only the edge of the desk, the sleeping bird weight, and the corner of the note that said to let the book rest until noon. Above it, through the glass roof, the stars remained where they were, bright enough for no one in particular, patient enough for everyone. That was Virgo under the quiet stars. Not perfection sharpened until nothing can breathe. Not worry disguised as care. Only the peace of small things put gently in place. A book returned, a page resting, a lamp lowered, a chair waiting for morning. The stars remain above the glass. The room is quiet. The fire is low. The night can keep the rest.